Goblin Slayer started from an unnamed 15-year-old priestess, who had recently become a porcelain-ranked adventurer, the lowest rank on the ladder. On her first day as an adventurer, the young priestess is invited by a group of novice adventurers to investigate a group of goblins believed to be responsible for the disappearance of several women in a village. Even though the guild staff had warned the young priestess and the others not to be rash and it was better to wait for the other adventurers as a backup, the rookies had taken the mission too lightly. They considered the goblins low-class monsters, so they didn't pay much heed to the guild staff's warnings. Thus, the priestess and her party went on their mission to slay the goblins with full confidence. Unfortunately, their confidence will be crushed by what they considered to be low-class monsters. Together, they headed to the designated area. However, when they encountered the goblins, they are soon overpowered and unable to fight back. Goblins possessed intelligence that allows them to fight well in groups, where they quickly capture, rape, and kill other members of the priestess's party. Just as Priestess was about to suffer the same fate as the rest of her party, she was saved by another adventurer, who introduced himself as Goblin Slayer. Just like his name, Goblin Slayer has spent his days hunting goblins, as evidenced by his extensive knowledge of said creatures, including how to deal with, find weaknesses, and defeat groups of goblins. Priestess decided to follow Goblin Slayer deeper into the cave, while Goblin Slayer killed more goblins and taught Priestess about goblin psychology and battle tactics to defeat them. With the help of the Priestess, Goblin Slayer was able to kill the remaining goblins very easily, including Goblin Shaman and Hobgoblin. Not only that, but Goblin Slayer also mercilessly killed several baby goblins, to avoid threats from goblins in the future, because goblins have intelligence and could hold a grudge. Meanwhile, despite the traumatic experiences experienced by Priestess, she has decided to remain an adventurer and follows Goblin Slayer as he wipes out the goblin group. With this, Priestess ended up becoming the first member of the Goblin Slayer party. On the other hand, even though Goblin Slayer was a silver-ranked adventurer, ranked third out of the existing 10 ranks, he received unpleasant treatment from other adventurers. This is because Goblin Slayer reached silver rank only by defeating goblins throughout his career as an adventurer. Not only that, but Goblin Slayer is also considered an outcast because of his low-quality armor, and also his obsession with only accepting goblin-related quests regardless of his status. Even so, Guild Girl really appreciates Goblin Slayer's dedication to slaughtering goblins. This is because most adventurers won't take goblin quests because the rewards are small. Everything had a reason, and so was Goblin Slayer's choice to slay goblins. In the past, when Goblin Slayer was a child, he lost his village and the entire family to an attack from goblins. The worst thing was how he witnessed before his own eyes how his older sister was raped and slowly killed by the goblins, while he could only watch in horror while holding back his tears. Since that incident, Goblin Slayer has decided to take revenge against the goblins and is determined to be strong just to kill all goblins, so that the same thing doesn't happen again in the future. Together with Priestess, who already understands the reason behind Goblin Slayer's excessive obsession with goblins, the two work together to slaughter the creatures. Slowly, Priestess got used to Goblin Slayer's attitude and began to understand the psychology and battle tactics of goblins. Sometime later, a unique party of silver-ranked adventurers consisting of a high elf archer, dwarf shaman, and lizard priest asked Guild Girl about the whereabouts of an adventurer they called Orkbalg or Beardcutter, who was actually Goblin Slayer in their race's native tongues. High Elf Archer explained that their race had united with the human kingdoms to fight against the resurrected Demon Lord's army, and they wanted to hire Goblin Slayer for a related quest. Although at first Goblin Slayer refused the offer because he was not at all interested in Demon Lords, he accepted it after Dwarf Shaman and Lizard Priest explained that the elves could not move their troops due to ruins in elven lands being occupied by goblins. A party composed of people from different races was formed, and they headed for the ruins. On the next day, High Elf Archer showed her ability as a ranger and tracker, where she can kill 3 enemies at once with just 1 arrow. High Elf Archer was also leading the way due to her skill in detecting traps. While usually in a goblin group there is a shaman leading the goblins marked with a totem, in the ruins there is no totem, which makes Goblin Slayer feel very wary. In a room there they found many carcasses with an elven prisoner who had been tortured by the goblins, making High Elf Archer very angry and vowing to avenge her fellow elves. Shortly after, they found a hall where the goblins were resting. The dwarf shaman and priestess teamed up by combining their 2 spells, Stupor and Silence, creating a sleep effect, so they could kill the sleeping goblins without making a fuss. Unfortunately, because the atmosphere was too quiet, it actually provoked the arrival of the goblins' leader, Ogre, one of the Demon Lord's generals. As expected of the Demon Lord's general, no matter how much they attacked, the ogre could regenerate quickly and counterattack using his strength and fire magic. The battles presented are also quite realistic, as they not only win based on strength and experience but also based on tactics and cooperation. While High Elf Archer attacked from a distance, Dwarf Shaman used Stone Blast, Lizard Priest is at the forefront with his Dragontooth Warrior, and Goblin Slayer uses his trump card in the form of teleportation magic given to him by the witch, which sends strong jets of water from the bottom of the ocean to injure the ogre and give it a killing blow. After help arrives to reclaim the ruins and help Goblin Slayer's party on their way back to the city, High Elf Archer's experience with Goblin Slayer makes her think of taking him on an actual adventure, not an adventure filled with wounds and traumatic experiences from fighting goblins. After recovering from his wounds, the dark story became a little warmer as Goblin Slayer had been spending some normal days without goblins. Goblin Slayer also received several thanks from several people he met, due to his actions which indirectly saved them from the threats they faced. Not only that, but Priestess has also been promoted to the next rank, from Porcelain to Obsidian, and it all happened thanks to Goblin Slayer who had saved her on the first day of her adventure. The Priestess wouldn't have been able to accomplish all of this without Goblin Slayer helping her. However, Goblin Slayer's quiet day returned to its rhythm after he received a special request to slay goblins from Sword Maiden, a servant of the all-powerful Supreme God, and one of the few adventurers that have defeated the Demon Lord. High Elf Archer, Dwarf Shaman, and Lizard Priest agreed to join Goblin Slayer in slaughtering the goblins, but at the cost that Goblin Slayer had to go on an adventure with them one day, which Goblin Slayer agreed to. After that, all of them went to Watertown, where they met the Sword Maiden. Sword Maiden informed that there has been a serial murder taking place recently in the city. The suspected culprit is the goblin in the city's sewer system. Since the army wouldn't be mobilized just to fight goblins and many adventurers had failed, Sword Maiden finally summoned Goblin Slayer, whose name was already quite famous. He agreed to take up the quest and went to the sewer only to find a group of goblins riding a ship. This is a big question for Goblin Slayer because even though goblins have high intelligence, they shouldn't be smart enough to build and operate boats. With the cooperation between all of them, where the priestess worked as a shield with her protection, the High Elf Archer attacked the goblins from a distance, the Goblin Slayer and Lizard Priest advanced to the forefront, while the Dwarf Shaman used his earth magic to sink the ship. It didn't stop there, they also utilized Giant Alligator to destroy other ships. When they reached the surface, Goblin Slayer was still thinking about how the goblins owned the ship and could operate it, leading him to conclude that someone was controlling and putting the group of goblins in the sewer. The next day, Goblin Slayer and his party tried to investigate the source of the goblins and brought a canary to warn them of poison gas in the sewer. The party went further and further into the sewer, and unfortunately, they were hit by a trap from a goblin and locked in a tomb. Just as Goblin Slayer had predicted, the goblins began pumping poisonous gas into the room, which is marked by the canary's chirps. With all the preparations that the Goblin Slayers had prepared, coupled with their acts of sealing off the vents to prevent the gas from entering, they managed to survive until finally a group of goblins emerged, led by the Goblin Champion. Although things went smoothly at first, as usual, things started to turn around after Goblin Slayer was hit by the Goblin Champion and received serious injuries. Priestess's left arm was bitten by Goblin Champion, the High Elf Archer's clothes were torn off and she was nearly raped by the goblins, while the Dwarf Shaman was trying to save the High Elf Archer and the Lizard Priest held the goblins down so the others wouldn't be surrounded further. In a state of serious injury, Goblin Slayer could only watch his party members cornered, reminding him of his powerless past and unable to do anything but watch his family being slaughtered by the goblins. With those memories of the past, coupled with the screams from the priestess, Goblin Slayer felt motivated, so he returned to his senses and delivered a surprise attack to the Goblin Champion from behind, tearing the Goblin Champion's right eye in the process. As a result of Goblin Slayer's actions, all the goblins there immediately felt afraid and decided to run away. Despite the dire circumstances they were in, none of them were truly injured, apart from Priestess and Goblin Slayer. However, Priestess's wounds had been successfully healed, while Goblin Slayer fainted instantly from the severe injuries he received. When Goblin Slayer awakens in the Temple of Law, the wounds he received have been healed thanks to a resurrection miracle from Sword Maiden and Priestess, a miracle that grants major recovery to both the latter and the user after sleeping with a virgin. Sword Maiden recounted her past to Goblin Slayer, where she was captured, raped, and tortured by goblins 10 years ago, explaining the source of Sword Maiden's injuries and partial blindness. Despite the fact that Sword Maiden was one of the heroes who had defeated the Demon Lord, the truth was that Sword Maiden had a great fear of goblins, a low-ranked monster. The next day, Goblin Slayer with his party returned to the sewer and found a room guarded by a powerful demon they called Giant Eyeball. By utilizing the fine flowers he spreads around the room, Goblin Slayer creates a dust explosion so that Giant Eyeball can be defeated. What surprised them was the existence of a mysterious mirror in the room, which they investigated immediately. It is known that the mirror is a gate that connects the sewers of Watertown with Green Moon, the place where the goblins actually come from. However, before they could do anything about the mirror, a group of goblins came to storm the place. While the lizard priest released the mirror from the wall, the rest of the party moved against the backlash from the goblins led by the goblin champion. Different from before, where they were trapped in a tomb, now they had an advantage and had devised several plans to defeat the goblins. After the lizard priest managed to remove the mirror from the wall, the dwarf shaman destroyed the ceiling of the wall so that all the goblins were crushed by the building, while the entire party was saved due to the protection from the mirror. Even though the mirrors could be sold for enormous prices, possibly hundreds or even thousands of gold, Goblin Slayer decided to destroy the mirror simply to prevent the goblins from learning how to use it again. From Goblin Slayer's report to Sword Maiden on the mission, it is known that the giant alligator in the previous sewer was Sword Maiden's familiar. Meanwhile, the mirror belonged to a demon-worshipping cult that should have been exterminated by the hero. An irony, Sword Maiden, who is a hero, actually delayed doing anything against goblins, because she secretly wants people to understand the cruelty that goblins can create, even though they were considered low-ranked monsters. The uniqueness in this scene is when Sword Maiden says that she can do anything for Goblin Slayer if he can relieve her trauma of goblins, to which Goblin Slayer responds that he is not interested in Sword Maiden because she is not a goblin. On the other hand, Goblin Slayer firmly said that he couldn't save Sword Maiden from her trauma, but he promised to kill goblins wherever and whenever Sword Maiden summoned him, even if it was in her dreams. With this, the mission in Watertown was completed, and they returned home to their city. Just like any other occupation, adventurers will also retire at some point, and Goblin Slayer will probably stop slaughtering goblins in the future. The question is, if that time comes, then what will happen to Goblin Slayer? Before that question could be answered, when Goblin Slayer conducted a daily patrol around the farm where he lived, he found goblin footprints in large numbers. Goblin Slayer was usually very confident that he would always win his battles against goblins, no matter if the ones he fought were hundreds, he would definitely win. However, this time Goblin Slayer was not sure that he could win this battle. From the footprints left behind, there were at least 10 sets of scout footprints, meaning that this horde had the Goblin Lord as their leader. Goblin Slayer went to the guild to ask the adventurers there to help him defeat the goblins because he couldn't do this alone. This was the first time Goblin Slayer had asked for help in person, which certainly took everyone there by surprise. However, no one had any intention of helping him because no reward would be given. Surprisingly, Goblin Slayer offered everything he had to all the adventurers there, such as equipment, assets, knowledge, and time as a reward for helping him fight against the horde of goblins. Feeling the seriousness of Goblin Slayer, in the end, everyone agreed to help Goblin Slayer. Even Guild Girl would give 1 gold piece for every 1 goblin they killed as a reward, making everyone even more excited to help Goblin Slayer. The first wave of the attack was a horde of goblins who fought using women as their meat shield. This is still fairly easy to overcome, as their cooperation and combination are strong. Magic users will use sleep effects on goblins, so low-ranked adventurers can save women who are used as a meat shield, while the rest will slaughter the goblins. In this episode, there are also goblins that have never been seen before, such as Rider, goblins who fight with wolves as their vehicles. Even though the number of goblins is very large, adventurers can defeat all the goblins that come with great ease, assuming that this quest is easy money with a reward of 1 gold piece for every goblin killed, and all this can be done thanks to the brilliant strategy of Goblin Slayer. Things got tenser when the hobgoblins and goblin champions appeared, forcing the low-ranked adventurers to retreat and leaving the veteran adventurers to handle the battle. On the other hand, when the Goblin Lord was about to flee because it was impossible for his horde to win, Goblin Slayer came and blocked him. The battle was quite exciting because the fight was not only shown on the Goblin Slayer side, but also by other adventurers against hordes of goblins on the farm. However, despite all the plans and preparations that Goblin Slayer had made, his abilities alone were not enough to defeat the Goblin Lord. Goblin Slayer had been defeated, and the Goblin Lord tortured Goblin Slayer mercilessly. It was only when Goblin Slayer was seriously injured that Priestess appeared, confining the Goblin Lord into 2 protections that squeezed him painfully. Apparently, it was all part of Goblin Slayer's plan, where he acted as bait to trap the Goblin Lord. Goblin Slayer realized that his abilities alone would not be enough to defeat the Goblin Lord, and therefore he devised a plan to defeat the Goblin Lord. After all the goblins on the farm had been defeated, the adventurers returned to the guild to celebrate their victory. Witnessing the laughter and excitement of everyone in the guild, for the first time Goblin Slayer had an interest in anything other than goblins. Goblin Slayer said to Cowgirl, his childhood friend, that he is now starting to have an interest in being a real adventurer and not just hunting goblins. Even more interesting was when Priestess asked Goblin Slayer for her reward, and that was for Goblin Slayer to take off his helmet and show his face in front of them all. Goblin Slayer agreed to do so, which not only amazed Priestess but also surprised all the adventurers in the guild, as this was the first time they had seen Goblin Slayer's true face. If in general the main character will be shown very clearly and is the main face of a series, Goblin Slayer as the main character has never shown his face at all, which makes this series more interesting and more unique than other series.